The wind never stopped. It was the first and last thing you knew about Redemption Gulch, a bitter sermon preached across the endless, sun-scorched plains of the territory. It came from a place with no name, carrying the grit of 1,000 barren miles, and it worked its way into everything. It scoured the paint from the rough-hewn buildings, leaving them the color of bone. It settled in the lines around a man's eyes, in the folds of a woman's dress, in the lukewarm coffee and the watery stew. The wind was a constant reminder of how small and temporary everything was beneath the vast, indifferent blue of the sky. The town itself was a scar on the landscape, a handful of wooden structures cowering together for warmth that wasn't there. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a livery stable made up its heart, all connected by a wide dirt street that was either a river of mud or a storm of dust. In the distance, the mountains clawed at the horizon, their jagged peaks like the broken teeth of some long-dead beast. This was a place of last chances and final endings, a town where survival was mistaken for living and hope was a currency scarcer than clean water. Tension was the air they breathed, a quiet desperation that settled deep in the belly. In a small, suffocating room above the Kane General Store, Ilara O'Connell stood before a looking-glass. Though she did not truly see her own reflection, she saw a ghost in white, a stranger with her own face. The dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk, shipped all the way from St. Louis, a thing of impossible beauty in this dusty corner of the world. It should have felt like a dream. It felt like a shroud. The tight bodice was a cage around her ribs, the heavy skirt an anchor chaining her to this spot. Her hair, a fiery red that had been her mother's pride, was a stark rebellion against the muted, dusty palette of the town, a splash of vibrant life in a room that felt like a tomb. But today, even its fire felt banked, the curls pinned and tamed into submission. With hands that felt clumsy and disconnected from her body, she smoothed a wrinkle from the silk. Joy was an alien country she had not visited in a long, long time. There was only this hollow ache, this cold acceptance of a fate she could not outrun. Her mind drifted back, as it so often did, to the green hills of County Cork, to the scent of rain and peat, to her father's booming laugh and her mother's gentle hand on her cheek. Their dream had been America, a land of open spaces and endless promise, a place to build a life free from famine and landlords. They had scraped together every last shilling, filled with a hope so bright it was almost painful to remember now. The journey had been an ordeal of storms and sickness, a crucible that tested the strongest souls, but the dream had held. It was only on the final leg of the trail, a 2-month crawl by wagon train across the unforgiving plains, that the dream had finally shattered. Cholera had swept through the camp like a phantom thief, silent and merciless. It had taken her mother first, then her father a week later. They were buried in shallow graves beside the trail, their wooden crosses already leaning in the ceaseless wind before the wagons had even rolled out of sight. She had arrived in Redemption Gulch an orphan, alone, with nothing to her name but a small trunk of worn clothes and a crushing debt. Silas Kane, the man who owned this store, this room, and nearly everything else in town, had financed their passage. He had presented her with the bill, a ledger of figures that might as well have been written in a foreign language. There was no way to pay it. And so, he had offered a solution, a marriage. His words had been smooth, cloaked in sympathy for her tragic loss, but his eyes held the cold glint of a prospector finding a new vein of gold. The debt would be forgiven. She would be his wife. It was not a proposal. It was a foreclosure. He was not acquiring a bride. He was collecting on an asset. A sharp knock on the door jolted her back to the present. Before she could answer, the door opened, and Silas Kane stepped inside. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit of dark wool that seemed to defy the heat and dust of the town. His silvering hair was perfectly combed, his face clean-shaven. He smiled, a practiced, charming expression that never quite reached his eyes. Those eyes, a pale, flat gray, were a predator's eyes, patient, watchful, and utterly devoid of warmth. "My dear Ilara," he said, his voice a low, cloying purr, "a vision, more beautiful than I could have imagined. He moved closer, and she had to fight the instinct to recoil. He smelled of expensive cologne and cigars, an odor of civilization that felt obscene in the stark little room. He took her hand, his touch dry and possessive. "I trust you are ready," he continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a way that made her skin crawl. "Our guests are assembling. The whole town is eager to celebrate our union." She said nothing, keeping her face a pale, still mask. "You have a duty, Ilara," he went on, his tone shifting slightly, the sweetness curdling into something harder. "A duty to me. I have shown you great generosity, taking you in when you had nothing, offering you my name and my protection. All I ask in return is your gratitude and your obedience. A small price to pay for the life I am giving you." It was a speech she had heard in various forms for weeks, a masterclass in twisting cruelty into kindness. He was not her savior, he was her jailer, and this wedding was the locking of the cell door. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a string of pearls, each one perfect and luminous. "A wedding gift," he announced, his smile widening. He stepped behind her and fastened the clasp around her neck. The pearls were cool against her skin, and heavy as a chain. In the looking glass, she saw his face hovering behind hers, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He owned her now, and he wanted the whole world to see it. Miles away in spirit, if not in distance, Sheriff Caleb Blackwood sat at the desk in his office. The room was a reflection of the man, stark, Spartan, and stripped of all non-essentials. A gun rack on the wall held a well-oiled rifle and a shotgun. A map of the territory, crisscrossed with his own pencil markings, was tacked above it. The only personal item was a small, faded photograph on the corner of his desk, its edges soft from handling. It showed a smiling woman with kind eyes and a small boy with a missing front tooth, frozen in a moment of sunlight and happiness that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Caleb did not look at the photograph. He did not need to. The image of his Sarah and his little Jacob was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. They had been taken from him 8 years ago, lost in a senseless raid by outlaws while he was away on a cattle drive. He had returned to a smoking ruin and a silence that had never truly left him. That day, something inside him had calcified, transforming a good-natured rancher into an unyielding instrument of justice. He had hunted down the men responsible, one by one, and in the process, found a new, bleak purpose. He had become the law. He was respected in Redemption Gulch, in the way a man respects a coiled rattlesnake. They knew he was fair, and they knew he was deadly. He spoke little, his words carrying the weight of his quiet authority. He was not a man to be trifled with, but he was not loved. The townsfolk, most of them beholden to Silas Kane in one way or another, kept a wary distance. For the past year, Caleb had been quietly, methodically building a case against Kane. He'd seen the pattern too many times to call it coincidence. An honest settler with good land would refuse Kane's low offer to buy. A few weeks later, there would be an accident, a barn fire, a poisoned well, a sudden stampede. The grieving family, broken and destitute, would then sell to Kane for pennies on the dollar. But proving it was another matter entirely. Kane was clever, using hired thugs and intimidation to cover his tracks, wrapping himself in a veneer of respectable business. To arrest a man like Silas Kane was to kick a hornet's nest the size of the whole damn territory. The office door creaked open, and his deputy, Ben Parker, shuffled in. Ben was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a nervous disposition but a core of loyalty that Caleb trusted. He was clutching a dirt-stained leather book to his chest as if it were a holy relic. "Sheriff," Ben stammered, his eyes wide, "you need to see this. I found it in the ashes of the Miller homestead." Caleb took the book. It was a ledger. The Millers were a family of 3 who had perished in a fire a month ago after refusing to sell their land to Kane. Caleb opened it, his expression grim. The pages were charred around the edges, but the writing in the middle was clear. It was a detailed account book, and tucked into the last few pages was a meticulous record of every threat, every act of vandalism, every visit from Kane's foreman, culminating in a final entry dated the day before the fire. Kane himself came today. Said if we won't sell, he'll burn us out. Said the land would be his one way or another. It was the proof he needed, damning, undeniable proof in the dead man's own hand. Caleb closed the ledger slowly. He could wait no longer. The wedding. Kane would be surrounded by the entire town, basking in his own power and arrogance. It was the perfect stage. It was time to show them all that no man, not even Silas Kane, was above the law. The half-finished church smelled of raw pine and nervous sweat. The townspeople were packed into the rough wooden pews, their Sunday best looking stiff and out of place. Their faces were a gallery of frontier emotions, the undisguised envy of women who wished for a rich husband, the quiet pity of those who knew Ilara's story, and the simple, morbid curiosity of the rest. Ilara felt their eyes on her as she walked down the short aisle on the arm of the town doctor, a man who owed Kane enough to do his bidding without question. Her face was a pale, defiant mask, her eyes fixed on the altar where Silas Kane waited, a smug, possessive smile on his lips. She felt as though she were walking to her own execution, the rustle of her silk dress the only sound in the suffocating silence. Her gaze swept over the crowd, searching for a single friendly face, a single glint of sympathy. She found none. They were not allies. They were merely witnesses to her demise. The preacher, a nervous man with a reedy voice, began the rites. His words washed over Ilara, meaningless and distant. She was detached, floating somewhere above her own body, a silent observer to the end of her own life. If any man can show just cause, why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak. The words hung in the thick, still air, and then, as if summoned by the invitation, the heavy church doors at the back of the nave swung open with a dramatic crash. Every head turned. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun, a tall, imposing shape that was instantly recognizable. Sheriff Caleb Blackwood. The crowd let out a collective gasp. A ripple of murmurs spread through the pews. Caleb paused for a moment, letting the silence settle again, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Then he began to walk, slowly and deliberately, down the center aisle. His spurs rang out on the wooden floorboards, each metallic chime a tolling bell in the sudden, deafening quiet. His gaze was fixed, not on the bride, not on the preacher, but entirely on Silas Kane. Kane's smile tightened into a sneer. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "this is a private celebration. I suggest you take your leave." Caleb did not stop until he stood directly before the altar. He looked from Kane to the preacher, then back to Kane. "Silas Kane," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the church. "I have a warrant for your arrest." The crowd erupted. Shouts and whispers filled the air. Kane threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Arrest? On what charge? Blackwood? Annoying my guests?" "On the charges of fraud, arson, and the murder of the Miller family," Caleb stated, his voice as steady and cold as Riverstone. He held up the charred ledger. Kane's face darkened, the mask of charm finally falling away to reveal the raw malice beneath. "That's preposterous. Now get out of my church." He gave a subtle nod, and two of his hired thugs, burly men who had been standing near the front pew, moved to stand between him and the sheriff. In that moment of chaos, as guns were about to be drawn and lives were about to be shattered, Ilara saw it. Not a plan, not a thought, but a desperate, terrifying opportunity. She did not know if this grim-faced sheriff was a savior or just another man vying for power in this wretched town. It did not matter. What mattered was that she could not, would not, marry Silas Kane. She moved before she even knew she was going to, a swift, decisive step that placed her directly in front of Kane, facing down the sheriff. She shielded her groom not to protect him, but to disrupt everything, to throw a wrench into the gears of this terrible machine. For one single, fleeting second, She would be the agent of her own fate, not its victim. Caleb's face was hard, his eyes narrowed. He drew his Colt peacemaker, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden hush. He leveled the barrel at her, his aim steady. "Step aside, ma'am," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Her heart was a wild drum against the cage of her ribs. Her whole world had shrunk to the dark, unwavering circle of that gun barrel and the man who held it. She looked past the weapon and into his eyes. They were not cold and cruel like Cain's. They were gray, like a stormy sky, and filled with a surprising, weary sadness that resonated with a deep, broken place inside her own soul. In those eyes, she saw a flicker of understanding, a shared knowledge of loss. And in that instant, she made her final, desperate gamble. Ilara lifted her chin. Her voice, when it came, rang out through the church, clear and shaking with a terror and a raw courage she did not know she possessed. "Shoot me if you must," she cried, the words both a plea and a challenge. "I would rather die by your hand than live as his." The entire town held its breath. The silence was absolute. Cain, behind her, let out a furious growl, but all Ilara could see was the sheriff's face. Caleb was visibly stunned. His jaw tightened, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in that moment, he saw not an accomplice shielding a criminal, but a fellow prisoner, a soul as trapped in this town as he was in his own past. Her raw, suicidal defiance mirrored the fierce, hopeless fight he had seen in his own wife's eyes before the end. In an instant, his cold, calculated plan to arrest a villain was shattered by an overwhelming, protective impulse he had thought long dead and buried. He saw a flicker of a future he had given up on. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the Colt peacemaker. The silence stretched, becoming so profound it was almost a physical weight. Then, in 2 long, purposeful strides, he closed the distance between them. He ignored the shocked gasps from the pews, ignored Cain's enraged shout of her name. He reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. His thumb brushed away a single, hot tear she hadn't known had fallen. And then, in front of God and the whole of Redemption Gulch, he claimed her lips. The kiss was not gentle. It was not a kiss of love or tenderness. It was a desperate, branding act, a claim, a promise, and an undeniable declaration of war. It was the taste of dust and sorrow, and a sudden, shocking spark of hope. It was a seal upon their fate, binding them together in the heart of the storm. He pulled away, but his eyes, blazing with a new and fearsome light, remained locked on hers. Around them, the world erupted into a stunned, chaotic uproar, but for that one breathless moment, there was nothing but the two of them, suspended in the silent, thunderous aftermath of a choice that had just changed everything. The world exploded into noise. Silas Cain's face, a moment before smug and triumphant, became a mask of purple rage. A strangled, inhuman sound tore from his throat as he lunged forward, his hands clawing for Ilara, for Caleb, for anything he could destroy. "Seize him!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "Seize that traitor! I want him hanged!" The church, which had been frozen in a state of shock, shattered into 100 different reactions. Cain's men, their hands already on their pistols, started forward. Other townsfolk, loyal to their benefactor, surged to their feet, shouting and shaking their fists. A few women screamed, many more simply stared, their faces pale, caught between fear of Cain's wrath and awe at the sheriff's audacity. The entire room became a chaotic shouting match, a pandemonium of rage and confusion. Through it all, Caleb Blackwood did not flinch. He never broke eye contact with Ilara, his gaze a steady anchor in the swirling tempest. With his free hand, he raised his Colt again, not aiming to shoot but to hold the line, a silent, deadly warning to Cain's men. They hesitated, their bravado faltering before the sheriff's cold resolve. Caleb's other hand found Ilara's, his grip firm and grounding. Her fingers were like ice, but he wrapped his own around them. a solid, living presence amidst the chaos. "Stay with me," he said, his voice a low command that was somehow also a plea. It cut through the din, meant for her ears alone. He began to move backward, pulling her with him, his pistol still holding the crowd at bay. Ilara moved as if in a daze, her lips still tingled, a strange, phantom warmth from the impossible kiss. Her mind was a whirlwind, unable to process the violent whiplash of the last few minutes. From bride to hostage, from prisoner to… what? What was she now? She stumbled after him, the heavy silk of her wedding dress catching on the rough floorboards, a ridiculous and cruel reminder of the life that had just been torn from her. They reached the doors and backed out into the harsh afternoon sun. The open air of the street was no less hostile. Faces peered from the windows of the saloon and the general store, from behind curtains in the rooms above. Eyes followed them, filled with a potent mixture of judgment and suspicion. They were a spectacle, the grim-faced sheriff and the runaway bride in her sullied white dress. Caleb did not lead her to the livery or out of town. He marched her directly across the dusty street to the one building that was his and his alone, the sheriff's office and jail. It was a solid, square-fronted structure of dark, weathered timber, the only fortress he had in a town that had, in the space of a single heartbeat, turned entirely against him. He pushed the door open, ushered her inside, and then shut it firmly behind them. The sound of the heavy iron bolt sliding home echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. It was a sound of finality, of a line being drawn in the sand, of a world being shut out. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the oak door, more fraught than the shouting in the church. It was thick with unspoken questions, with the raw, vibrating energy of what had just passed between them. Ilara stood in the middle of the room, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths, the adrenaline finally giving way to a tidal wave of confusion and a hot, searing anger. She finally found her voice. And it was not the voice of a damsel in distress. It was the voice of a woman who had been pushed one step too far. "What have you done?" she demanded, whirling to face him. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "What in God's name gives you the right?" Caleb watched her, his face unreadable, his stormy gray eyes giving away nothing. "You barge into that church," she spat, the word wedding catching in her throat like a shard of glass. "You accuse a man, you draw a gun, and then you put your hands on me, you kissed me, in front of everyone." Her voice rose, laced with a hysteria she could not control. "You made a spectacle of me. You have ruined me. Do you have any idea what you have done?" She was not thinking of Silas Kane's crimes or the danger she had been in. She was thinking of the stares, the whispers, the condemnation she had seen in the eyes of the town. She had been on the verge of one kind of prison, and this man had just thrown her into another, a prison of shame and scandal. She saw his actions not as a rescue, but as an assertion of power, another man deciding her fate without her consent. Caleb listened to her tirade with a stoic, unmoving patience. He let her vent all of her fury and fear until she finally ran out of words, her shoulders slumping, her chest heaving with exhausted sobs. He waited a moment more, then moved to his desk and placed his gun belt upon it with a heavy thud. He did not offer excuses or apologies. "Silas Kane murdered 3 people, he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. A man, his wife, and their son. He burned them alive in their home because they would not sell him their land. Marrying him would not have been a life, Miss O'Connell. It would have been a different kind of death sentence." He gestured to the charred ledger lying on his desk. "This is their account book. It details every threat Kane made against them. I have other accounts, too, from settlers who were too scared to speak up before now, who saw Kane's men poison wells and scatter herds." He laid the facts out before her, piece by grim piece, not as a defense of his actions, but as a simple, unadorned statement of the truth. "My intent was to arrest him, to stop that ceremony from making you his property and a witness he would eventually have to silence. Everything I did was calculated." He paused, his gaze finally meeting hers. "Almost everything." The unspoken admission hung in the air between them. The kiss. That had not been part of the plan. And so began their forced cohabitation. The sheriff's office was a small, two-room affair. The main office held Caleb's desk, a wood stove, a gun rack, and two iron-barred holding cells against the far wall. A single door led to a small, Spartan living quarter in the back, containing little more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small table with two chairs. This cramped space was now to be their world. "You will stay here," Caleb said. It was not a request. "It is the only place in this town where I can be sure you are safe. Cain will not take this lying down. He will try to get you back, or he will try to silence you for what you might have overheard in his house. Either way, you are not safe alone." Ilara stared at him, horrified. "Stay here? With you? I cannot. It is unthinkable." The social implications crashed down on her with their full, suffocating weight. An unmarried woman, living under the same roof as the sheriff, unchaperoned. In the eyes of the town, she would be no better than a common prostitute. She would be a pariah, a fallen woman. "I am afraid you have little choice in the matter," Caleb replied, his tone leaving no room for debate. The social prejudice she feared was not long in coming. The very next morning, a delegation of concerned women, led by the town's self-righteous matriarch, Martha Gable, appeared on the sheriff's doorstep. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose wealth was directly tied to her husband's profitable dealings with Silas Cain, pounded on the door with a gloved fist. Caleb opened it, his large frame filling the doorway. "Sheriff Blackwood," Mrs. Gable began, her voice dripping with sanctimonious disapproval. "We have come on behalf of the decent people of this town. It is an affront to all Christian morality that you are keeping that young woman in there with you. We demand that she be placed in a proper home, or sent away, until this sordid matter can be resolved. This is my office and my home, Mrs. Gable," Caleb said calmly, "and Miss O'Connell is under my protection. That is all you need to know." He started to close the door, but Ilara, who had been listening from the back room, heard one of the other women whisper, her voice carrying clearly into the office. "He has some nerve, protecting that little Irish harlot after what she did." The words were a physical blow, sharp and ugly. It was the same venom, the same prejudice she had faced since the moment she stepped off the boat in New York, the assumption that an Irish girl alone was a girl of loose morals. Caleb shut the door firmly, his face a granite mask, but the damage was done. The town had passed its verdict. The days that followed were a tense, silent dance of proximity and avoidance in the cramped quarters. They shared meals of beans and coffee in a silence so thick it felt like a third person at the table, each acutely aware of the other's every breath and movement, to reclaim some small piece of agency, to create a sense of order in her upended life. Ilara took over the small domestic tasks. She swept the floors, washed their few dishes, and mended a tear in one of Caleb's shirts. It was not an act of subservience, but of survival, a way to keep from going mad in the suffocating confinement. Caleb watched her quiet, determined movements. He noted the resilience in the set of her shoulders and the quiet dignity with which she carried her shame. He was profoundly unused to having a woman's presence in his home again. The scent of her, a faint smell of soap and lavender, was a ghost in the Spartan, masculine space. It stirred a painful mix of old memories, of his Sarah humming as she kneaded bread, and new, unfamiliar feelings that he promptly and ruthlessly suppressed. A small glimmer of hope arrived one afternoon in the form of Sarah Jenkins, the local schoolteacher. She was a quiet, bookish woman with a spine of steel, one of the few people in town who had never fallen under Cain's spell. She came to the back door of the office, pretending to be asking the sheriff a question about a stray dog, and slipped a small parcel into Ilara's hands. It contained a copy of Jane Eyre and a freshly baked apple cake. "Do not let them break you, Ilara," the schoolteacher whispered, her eyes kind and steady. "Not everyone in this town is blind." The small act of kindness was a lifeline. It was a reminder that she was not entirely alone, that decency had not completely fled Redemption Gulch. Elara devoured the book and the cake, both a nourishment for a starving soul. Meanwhile, Silas Kane began his retaliation. Enraged and publicly humiliated, he marshaled his considerable wealth and influence to turn the town into a weapon against them. He called a town council meeting at the saloon, a meeting from which Sheriff Blackwood was explicitly barred. He stood before the assembled business owners and ranchers, men who depended on his loans and his goodwill, and painted Caleb as a dangerous, unstable vigilante who had abducted an innocent bride from the very altar of God. He fabricated stories about Caleb's past, twisting his tragic history into a narrative of violence and obsession. He questioned the sheriff's fitness for office, and by the end of the night, he had the council drafting a petition to have Caleb removed. The squeeze became financial. The owner of the general store, a man Kane owned lock, stock, and barrel, informed Caleb that his credit had been revoked. From now on, the law in Redemption Gulch would have to pay cash. The psychological warfare soon gave way to physical threats. One night, as Elara was trying to read by the thin light of a kerosene lamp, a rock crashed through the front window of the office, showering the floor with glass. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his gun in his hand. Elara rushed to the front room to see him snatching the rock from the floor. A piece of dirty paper was tied around it. He untwisted it and read the vile message, his face hardening into a furious mask. He crumpled it in his fist before she could see the words. His reaction was swift and terrifying. He stormed out the front door and into the dark, empty street, his voice booming with a rage she had never heard. "Show yourselves, you cowards!" he roared into the night. But the perpetrators were long gone, swallowed by the darkness. The incident shattered the fragile, unspoken peace that had begun to form between them. The violence of Kane's hatred had invaded their sanctuary, and the air was once again thick with tension. Later that night, long after the town had settled into a fearful silence, Elara found she could not sleep. She slipped out of the back room and found Caleb in the main office, sitting at his desk in the dim lamplight. He was methodically cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and controlled, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the stock. The tough, unreadable exterior had finally cracked. In the faint light, she could see the immense pressure he was under, the terrible weight of his duty, his past, and now her safety, all resting on his shoulders. For the very first time, she saw him not as a lawman, an aggressor, or her jailer. She saw a lonely, embattled man fighting a war on all fronts, completely alone. She noticed a small, dark line of blood trickling from a cut on the back of his hand, where a shard of glass from the window must have caught him. Without a word, she went to the washstand, dampened a clean cloth, and returned to his side. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wary. She didn't speak. She simply reached out, took his large, wounded hand in hers, and gently began to clean the cut. The simple, gentle act of care, offered without expectation or demand, seemed to break through his iron reserve. He watched her, his expression softening, his eyes filling with a raw vulnerability she had never seen before. The formidable sheriff was gone, and in his place was just a man. "My wife," he said, his voice quiet and rough with emotion. "Her name was Sarah, too, like the schoolteacher." Elara paused, her fingers still resting on his hand. She looked up and met his gaze. "She was killed," he continued, his eyes focused on something far away, a painful memory playing out behind them. "Bandits hit our ranch when I was away. They took everything. She fought them. She was brave, too brave." His voice caught. "I was not there to protect her. My boy, Jacob, he was only 7. If I had been there, I could have done something. It is a failing I have lived with every day since." He finally looked at Elara, and she saw the deep-seated fear that drove him. "I cannot fail again," he whispered, the confession a raw, open wound. "I cannot let what happened to her happen to you." The quiet, late-night confession hung in the air, a bridge of shared pain suddenly spanning the gulf between them. Elara, moved by his honesty, found herself offering a piece of her own brokenness in return. "My parents," she said softly, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "They dreamed of this country. They believed it was a promised land. They died on the trail, thinking they had failed me, leaving me with nothing but their debt." She looked down at his hand, still held in hers. "I have been so alone for so long." In the quiet office, surrounded by the hostile darkness of Redemption Gulch, they were no longer jailer and prisoner, lawman and pariah. They were two survivors, two profoundly lonely souls who had lost everything, finding a flicker of understanding in each other's eyes. She finished cleaning the cut and tied a strip of clean cloth around his hand. Their fingers brushed, and a current, quiet but undeniable, passed between them. They sat there for a long time in the shared pool of lamplight, the silence no longer heavy with mistrust, but filled with the beginning of a fragile, unspoken connection. The late-night confession did not break the dam, but it opened a channel between them. The fragile truce, born of desperation and shared grief, slowly, quietly, deepened into a tentative alliance. The oppressive silences that had once filled the small rooms gave way to a new kind of quiet, one that was comfortable, companionable. The space between them was no longer a chasm of mistrust, but a common ground where they could finally lower their defenses. They began to talk, not about the ever-present threat of Silas Kane or the hostile town outside their door, but about the people they had been before their worlds had ended. The stories came in fragments, offered up in the quiet moments of the day, while cleaning his pistol one afternoon. Caleb spoke of the small farm he had once owned, nestled in a green valley 2 territories over. He described the way the light hit the fields in the early morning, the smell of the rich, dark earth after a rain. He told her how his wife, Sarah, used to hum while she tended her garden, a tuneless, happy sound that had been the background music of his life. He spoke of these things in a low, even voice, as if describing a place he had visited in a dream. In return, Elara gave him pieces of her own lost world. She spoke of the impossible green of the Irish hills, of the folk tales her father would tell by the fire, stories of cunning heroes and magical creatures. She described the taste of her mother's soda bread, the texture of a life that was now as distant and mythical as the tales themselves. In sharing these ghosts, they were not just recounting memories. They were coloring in the faded outlines of the people they were, reminding themselves, and each other, that they were more than just the sum of their tragedies. This growing intimacy was woven into the simple, stark routines of their daily lives. One bright, hot afternoon, Caleb placed his Colt Peacemaker on the table in front of her. The heavy blued steel seemed to absorb all the light in the room. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I cannot be with you every second of every day. You need to be able to defend yourself." Her first instinct was to refuse, to recoil from the cold, brutal purpose of the weapon. But the memory of the rock crashing through the window, the fear she had felt, was still sharp. She nodded, her expression grim. The lesson was a thing of intense, unexpected proximity. He stood behind her, his large frame a solid wall of heat at her back. "Your stance is wrong," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. He placed his hands on her waist to shift her position, and a jolt went through her, sharp and surprising. "You need to be balanced." He showed her how to load the cylinder, his large, calloused fingers moving with an economy and grace that was mesmerizing. Then, he placed the gun in her hand and wrapped his own hand over hers to guide her grip. Her fingers were lost in his. She could feel the strength in his hand, the controlled power that was so different from Kane's grasping possessiveness. The smell of gun oil and worn leather filled her senses, mingling with a clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," he instructed, his body shielding hers as he helped her aim at a tin can set on a post in the small yard behind the office. "Do not jerk it." The explosion, when it came, was a deafening roar that made her flinch, but the power that kicked back through her arm was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. The can remained untouched, But in that moment, holding the weapon, feeling his steady presence around her, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time, a sense of her own power. For Caleb, watching her determination, the way she bit her lip in concentration, the quick intelligence in her eyes as she listened to his instruction, stirred a deep and unsettling admiration that was quickly, dangerously, transforming into something more. A key turning point came one evening without warning. The day had been unnaturally still and hot, the air thick and heavy as a wool blanket. As dusk fell, the sky to the west turned a bruised, ugly purple. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the distant mountains. Soon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in, a perfect mirror for the turmoil of their lives. The wind hit the small building like a fist, rattling the windows in their frames. Rain began to hammer against the roof, a deafening, relentless drumming. Brilliant flashes of lightning illuminated the room in stark, brief tableaus of white light and sharp, black shadow, followed by cracks of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The storm unnerved Alara more than she wanted to admit. The roaring wind and the lashing rain brought back terrifying memories of the ocean crossing, of being trapped in the dark, groaning belly of the ship, at the mercy of a vast and violent sea. She felt a tremor run through her and wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hide her fear. Caleb, sitting across the small table from her, saw it. He saw the subtle trembling of her hands, the way her gaze darted towards the window with each flash of lightning. He did not mock her or ignore it. He simply set aside the book he had been reading and leaned forward slightly. "My father bought me my first horse when I was 10, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that was a counterpoint to the raging storm. She was a half-wild Mustang named Flicker, because she was always moving, always twitching. I was scared to death of her. I was sure she was going to throw me and break my neck." Alara looked at him, drawn in by the unexpected story. "The first time I tried to ride her in the open," he continued, his eyes focused on the memory. "A storm just like this one blew in out of nowhere. The wind was howling, and the thunder was shaking the ground. Flicker went wild. She was bucking and rearing, and all I could do was hang on for dear life, my face buried in her mane. I was crying. I was so scared. And then I heard my father's voice, yelling over the wind. He was not telling me to be brave or to stop crying. He just said, 'Listen to her, son. Feel her rhythm. Move with her, not against her.'" He looked at Alara, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "So I did. I stopped fighting the horse and the storm. I just held on and moved with her. And after a while, she calmed down. We rode the storm out together. He did not touch her. He did not offer any grand pronouncements of comfort. He simply sat there, his solid presence a reassuring shield against the tempest both outside and within her. His quiet story was an anchor, a simple, grounding tale of fear and survival, the shared moment of quiet intimacy, of him offering comfort without demand, was more powerful and more meaningful than any romantic gesture. When the storm finally passed an hour later, leaving behind the clean, earthy smell of rain-soaked dust, the space between them had changed forever. Their investigation into Silas Kane was no longer his mission, but theirs. They were a team. Ilara's mind, sharpened by a lifetime of observation from the sidelines, proved to be an invaluable asset. She began to recall small, seemingly insignificant details from her time as Kane's ward, a name mentioned in passing, a hushed conversation she had overheard between Kane and his foreman about water rights, a late-night visitor who had come and gone in secret. Each fragment was a piece of a puzzle. Caleb, with his deep knowledge of the territory and its people, could often provide the missing context. "Elias Vance," he would murmur, when she mentioned the name of the visitor. "He is a land surveyor of questionable morals. If he was meeting with Kane, they were planning a swindle." Their evenings were spent poring over maps of the territory and the charred pages of the Miller Ledger by lamplight, their heads bent close together over the small table, their hands occasionally brushing as they pointed to a line on the map or a figure in the book. They were no longer just sharing a space. They were sharing a purpose, and in that shared purpose, a deep and powerful bond was being forged. Their alliance, however, did not go unnoticed. Silas Kane, seeing that his campaign of social ostracism and veiled threats had failed, escalated his attacks. He could not risk a direct assault on the sheriff's office, so he began to target their few allies, determined to isolate them completely. The first blow fell on Sarah Jenkins. One morning, the town awoke to find the schoolhouse vandalized, vile. Crude messages were painted across the walls in thick black paint. They targeted the schoolteacher for her friendship with the sheriff, and they targeted Ilara with a particular, venomous cruelty, calling her a foreign whore. The attack was a clear message, a public branding of anyone who dared to stand with them. The second blow came a few nights later. Ilara was awakened by a panicked shouting from the street and the terrifying smell of smoke. Caleb was already pulling on his boots. "Stay here and lock the door," he commanded, his face grim, before grabbing a bucket and running out into the night. From the window, she could see a hellish orange glow coming from the direction of the livery stable. It was where Caleb kept his horse, a powerful buckskin named Buck. A few minutes later, unable to bear the suspense, she ignored his order, grabbed another bucket, and ran towards the fire. The scene at the stables was one of chaos. A small crowd had gathered, but few were helping. Most were just watching, their faces illuminated by the flames. The stable was burning fiercely, thick black smoke billowing into the night sky. Caleb was there, his face black with soot, trying to calm the terrified, screaming horses inside. Ilara joined him, her heart pounding, and together they worked, leading the panicked animals out of the inferno. They managed to get Buck and the other horses out just before the roof of the stable collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. The message was brutally clear. Cain could and would destroy everything and everyone Caleb cared about. The fire was a turning point. Standing in the smoky, smoldering ruins of the stable, watching Caleb check Buck for injuries, his face a mask of cold, contained fury. Ilara realized the full extent of the danger they faced, but something else crystallized within her in that moment. She was no longer just a victim in this conflict, a piece to be moved around on a board by powerful men. Her fate was now inextricably, irrevocably tied to Caleb's. The thought of leaving him, of running away to save herself while he stayed to face Cain alone, was unbearable. Her instinct for survival, which had been her only guide for so long, had been replaced by a fierce, unyielding loyalty. That realization led to the final crumbling of the emotional walls between them. Later that night, back in the tense quiet of the office, the adrenaline of the fire still coursing through their veins, the unspoken thing that had been growing between them finally broke the surface. Ilara found Caleb standing by the newly boarded-up window, staring out into the darkness. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tight with a contained rage and a crushing guilt. She knew he was blaming himself for what was happening, for the danger he had brought upon his friends. She approached him quietly, her heart aching for him. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. He turned at her touch, and the look in his eyes stopped her breath. All the stoicism, all the control, was gone. His eyes were filled with a desperate, raw longing that mirrored the unspoken ache in her own soul. In that one unguarded look, she saw all the unspoken tension of their shared confinement, all the shared fears of the last few weeks, and a burgeoning desire that was as powerful and undeniable as the storm they had weathered together. He pulled her to him, his hands gripping her arms, and this time, the kiss was not a public declaration of war. It was a private, mutual surrender. It was a kiss of desperation and comfort, of shared grief and a deep, passionate feeling that had been building since the moment she had challenged him to take her life. It was a raw, hungry acknowledgement that in this hostile, violent world, they were each other's only sanctuary. The kiss deepened, and he swept her up into his arms, carrying her from the stark office into the small, private space of the back room. Their lovemaking that followed was not just an act of passion, but one of profound emotional release. It was a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death and destruction, a fierce and tender claiming of a small piece of peace in the midst of a war. For Caleb, it was the first time he had allowed himself to feel anything for a woman since his wife's death, a breaking of the long, lonely vigil he had kept over his own heart. For Ilara, it was the first time she had ever been with a man who saw her not as a possession or a problem, but as a person. The first time she had ever been touched with a reverence and a cherishing care that was, in itself, a form of healing. In the quiet aftermath, they lay tangled in each other's arms under a single thin blanket, the sounds of the hostile town outside seeming to fade into a distant murmur. They both knew, without a word being spoken, that there was no going back. They were no longer just allies in a fight, they were partners in every sense of the word. What they had found in each other was not a weakness for Cain to exploit, but a source of immense, unshakable strength. As the first, pale light of dawn began to filter through the small window, a new day breaking over the unforgiving landscape of Redemption Gulch, they were no longer just surviving. They were fighting for a future they now knew they had to share together. The stakes had been raised from their very lives to the preservation of the fragile, beautiful thing they had just found in the dark. The night they came together changed the very air in the small, besieged sheriff's office. A new intimacy, quiet and profound, settled over them, solidifying their partnership into a formidable force. Their mornings, once fraught with a tense and heavy silence, were now filled with the low murmur of conversation over bitter coffee, their heads bent together as they planned their next move against Silas Cain. The oppressive sense of confinement had been replaced by a feeling of sanctuary, a tiny island of warmth in a cold and hostile sea. There was a new tenderness in their interactions, a language spoken in touches and glances, a lingering brush of his fingers against hers as he handed her a cup, a shared smile that held more meaning than a volume of words, a steadying hand he would place on the small of her back as she passed by. These small moments of connection stood in stark contrast to the growing danger that pressed in on them from outside their door. Their love, born in chaos and forged in defiance, became the quiet, unshakable center of the storm, a deep well of courage and resolve from which they both drew strength. It was this newfound strength that sharpened their focus. They could no longer afford to be reactive, to wait for Cain to make a mistake. They had to go on the offensive, to find a crack in the fortress of fear he had built around himself. Their investigation became more daring, their late-night discussions more focused. "He uses other men to do his dirty work," Caleb said one evening, his finger tracing a line on the territory map. "But there must have been times he acted alone. The Miller fire was one, I am sure of it, but the first big land grab, the Double K Ranch, that was different." The Double K was the sprawling, prime piece of land that now formed the heart of Cain's empire. Its previous owner, a crusty old rancher named Arthur Abernathy, had died in what was ruled a riding accident a year ago, falling from a high cliff on his property. His estranged children, living back east, had been all too happy to sell the land to Cain for a fraction of its worth. Abernathy was too good a horseman to just fall off a cliff, Caleb mused. His eyes narrowed in thought. "I always suspected something was wrong with that story." Ilara, remembering the whispers and gossip from her time in Cain's house, suddenly looked up. "Jedediah," she said, the name coming to her in a flash. "I heard Cain talking about him once. A ranch hand. Cain's foreman said he was a drunkard and a liar, that Cain had been right to fire him right after Mr. Abernathy's accident." Caleb's gaze sharpened. Jedediah Clay. He worked for Abernathy for 20 years. He was let go the day after the funeral. I had forgotten about him. He stood up, a new energy in his movements. If anyone saw what really happened that day, it was Jedediah. Finding him was a challenge. Jedediah Clay lived like a ghost on the far outskirts of town, in a squalid, leaning shack built of scrap lumber and hope. He was a man drowning his fears in cheap whiskey, terrified of Cain's long shadow. Caleb knew a direct approach from a lawman would only scare him deeper into his bottle. They approached the shack under the cover of a moonless night, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the sound of their own cautious footsteps. The place reeked of stale liquor and despair. A single guttering candle cast flickering, monstrous shadows inside. Caleb knocked on the flimsy door. After a long silence, a raspy voice from within croaked, "Go away." "Jedediah," Caleb called, his voice low but firm. "It is Sheriff Blackwood. I need to talk to you." The silence stretched, and then the door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a man's face, gaunt, unshaven, with wild, paranoid eyes. "I got nothing to say to the law," he hissed, and tried to slam the door. Caleb blocked it with his boot. The meeting was already turning sour. Jedediah was a cornered animal, too consumed by fear to listen to reason. It was then that Alara stepped forward, moving into the thin sliver of candlelight from the doorway. "Mr. Clay," she said, her voice soft but clear, "please, we are not here to cause you trouble." Jedediah blinked, his suspicious gaze falling on her. "Who are you?" "My name is Alara O'Connell," she said. "I was supposed to marry Silas Kane." The man's eyes widened in recognition. He had seen her at the church. He slowly, hesitantly, opened the door a little wider. They stepped inside the cramped, foul-smelling shack. Jedediah stood huddled in the corner, clutching a half-empty bottle like a shield. Caleb started to speak, to lay out the case, but Alara put a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. She knew this was not a matter of law, but of conscience. She looked at Jedediah, not with pity or judgment, but with a deep and genuine empathy. "I know what it is to be trapped by him," she began, her voice quiet and steady. "I know how he uses people, how he twists their lives into knots until they cannot see any way out. He did it to my family. He did it to me. He promises you everything, but all he gives is a cage." She told him her story, her voice never wavering. She spoke of her parents' dreams, of the debt, of the cold, possessive way Kane had claimed her as his property. She created a bond of shared victimhood, a bridge of understanding between the disgraced Irish girl and the broken-down ranch hand. "The silence," she said, her gaze holding his. "That is the worst part. The silence when you know a thing is wrong, and you say nothing. It eats at you. It hollows you out until there is nothing left. I know you saw what happened to Mr. Abernathy. And I know the weight of that silence has been a heavier burden than any bottle." Jedediah began to tremble, his eyes filling with tears. Her words had found their mark, striking the last, buried core of the decent man he had once been. He sank onto a rickety stool, the bottle slipping from his grasp. "I saw it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was bringing a stray back from the high pasture. They was up on Widow's Peak, Abernathy and Kane, arguing. Abernathy was yelling, saying Kane was a thief and a liar, and then Kane just shoved him. A hard shove, right in the chest. Mr. Abernathy, he went right over the edge. His horse screamed. Kane, he just stood there for a minute, looking down. Then he took a rock and struck the horse on the head to make it look like it had spooked and thrown him. The confession, once started, poured out of him in a torrent of guilt and grief. When he was finished, the small shack was silent save for the sound of his ragged sobs. Ilara's courage had given him the strength to finally speak the truth. With a witness secured, Caleb knew time was their enemy. He could not trust the local judge or anyone else in Redemption Gulch. He had to get Jedediah to the territorial marshal in the next county, a day's hard ride away. They made plans to leave in secret in 2 days, under the cover of the new moon. The next 48 hours were filled with a strange and potent mixture of hope and impending doom. The end of their fight was in sight, but the danger had never been greater. They savored their time together, knowing it might be their last moments of peace. On the afternoon before they were due to leave, Caleb took Alara by the hand. "Come with me," he said. He led her out of the back of the office, away from the prying eyes of the town, and up a winding, barely there trail into the low hills. After a 20-minute walk, they came to a hidden creek, a place of impossible beauty and seclusion. A small waterfall tumbled over smooth rocks into a crystal-clear pool, surrounded by shady cottonwood trees. The air was cool and filled with the gentle sound of running water. "I used to come here sometimes," Caleb said quietly. Before, when I needed to think." It was a moment of pure, unadulterated peace, a glimpse of the simple, quiet life they could have together, a life away from the dust and violence of Redemption Gulch. They sat on a smooth, sun-warmed rock, their shoulders touching, and for a few precious hours. They were not a lawman and a fugitive. They were just a man and a woman, falling in love. The idyllic scene, with its soft light and gentle sounds, was a deliberate and heartbreaking calm before the storm. The storm broke with a brutal, monstrous force that very night. Silas Kane, through his network of spies that infested every corner of the town, had learned of their visit to Jedediah's shack. He realized the game had changed. He could no longer afford the slow bleed of social manipulation. He had to end this, now. He decided to eliminate all his problems at once, but he did not go after the drunkard hiding in his shack. Instead, he orchestrated a far more monstrous plan, a plan designed not just to silence his enemies, but to utterly break the man who led them. He targeted their only true friend, Sarah Jenkins. As the schoolteacher was walking home after dark, her arms full of books, Kane's ruthless foreman and 2 other men ambushed her on the quiet, dusty path. They did not kill her. Death would have been a mercy. They delivered a brutal, savage beating, meant to shatter and demoralize. Then, as a final, horrific statement, they set fire to the schoolhouse, the one place in that bleak town that had symbolized hope, knowledge, and a future. They left Sarah for dead in the dirt, pinning a hastily scrawled note to the collar of her dress. "This is what happens to the sheriff's friends." Caleb and Alara were the first to see the flames. The orange glow against the night sky was unmistakable. "That is the school," Caleb said, a terrible premonition in his voice, and they ran. The sight that greeted them was horrific. The simple wooden schoolhouse was engulfed in flames, a funeral pyre for the town's innocence. It was Caleb who saw her, a crumpled shape lying just beyond the ring of firelight. He let out a choked cry and rushed to her side, gathering her limp, broken body into his arms. Alara, her mind reeling in horror, frantically tried to beat back the encroaching flames with a fallen branch, a futile, desperate gesture. They got Sarah to the town doctor, a timid man who paled when he saw the extent of her injuries and the name of his patient. He was a man deeply intimidated by Kane, and his hands shook as he reluctantly tended to her wounds. She was alive, but barely. She was broken. The town's reaction was a new and sickening low. Instead of blaming Kane, whose cruelty was an open secret, many people, their spines dissolved by fear and their minds twisted by Kane's relentless propaganda, turned on Caleb and Alara. They gathered in whispering, resentful knots, their faces hard with blame, their defiance, the whispers said, had brought this violence upon them all. Sarah Jenkins had paid the price for their sins. The social prejudice they had faced before curdled into an outright, seething hatred. This event was Caleb's breaking point, as he stood watch over Sarah's bedside, seeing her battered face, so full of pain and fear. He was consumed by a cold, silent rage and a crushing, tidal wave of guilt. He saw his first wife's face superimposed over Sarah's. He saw another innocent woman brutalized because of him, because he had failed to protect her. His long and lonely quest for justice had brought nothing but suffering to the very people he sought to defend. The weight of his failure was absolute. He left the doctor's house and walked back to the office, his movements stiff and robotic. Alara, who had followed him, saw the change in him immediately. The warmth, the tenderness, the connection they had built was gone, replaced by the cold, hard shell of the lawman he had been when she first met him. Only now it was 100 times more impenetrable. He did not look at her. He went to his desk and began checking the loads in his pistol. "You need to leave, Alara," he said, his voice flat and dead. She stared at him, her heart turning to ice. "What are you talking about?" "Pack your things," he said, still not looking at her. "Take my horse, ride east, and do not stop until you are clear of this territory. I will give you all the money I have." "Caleb, no," she pleaded, moving towards him. "I am not leaving you." He finally looked up, and his eyes were the eyes of a stranger, cold, distant, and filled with a pain so profound it was terrifying to behold. "Look at what happened to Sarah. That was a message. For me. He will come after you next, and I cannot stop him. I cannot protect you." He believed his love for her, the one good and hopeful thing in his life, was a magnet for violence, a danger to her very existence. This was the central crisis, the moment their entire world hung in the balance. Ilara was devastated by his withdrawal, by the wall he had thrown up between them, but she refused to break. The love she felt for him, the strength he had shown her she possessed, rose up in her, fierce and unyielding. She walked right up to his desk, her own eyes blazing. "You are wrong," she said, her voice shaking with emotion but ringing with conviction. "Silas Kane did not do this because you are weak. He did this because you are strong. He did this because for the first time in his miserable life, someone in this town has dared to stand up to him. Someone is not afraid of him. And that someone is you." She leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk. "I am not leaving you. I will not run and hide while you face him alone. We will face this together, or we will not face it at all." Her voice dropped, becoming thick with emotion. She looked him straight in the eye, her love a shield against his despair. "You think your love is a danger to me?" she said, the words a raw and powerful truth. "It is the only thing keeping me alive." Her words, so full of courage and unwavering faith, were the one thing that could have broken through the armor of his grief-stricken rage. He stared at her, his frozen expression finally cracking. The pain in his eyes was overwhelming. With a choked sound, he pushed back from the desk and pulled her into a desperate, crushing embrace, burying his face in her hair. He clung to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just turned to ash. The tragedy had not broken them apart. It had fused them together with a darker, stronger, and more unyielding bond. They both knew this was now a fight to the death. The part ended with them holding each other in the dark, silent office, the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes like a funeral shroud. Their shared grief and their unshakable love were forging a resolve as hard and as deadly as steel. They would not just bring Silas Kane to justice. They would make him pay for everything he had done. The aftermath of the attack on Sarah Jenkins cast a dark, suffocating pall over Redemption Gulch. The town, once merely tense, was now paralyzed by a collective, unspoken terror. Fear was a contagion, and Silas Kane was its carrier. Citizens who had once offered Caleb a guarded nod now openly shunned him and Ilara, crossing the wide, dusty street to avoid even the possibility of their paths intersecting. The atmosphere was thick with a cloying menace, a sense of violence waiting just beneath the surface of the town's sun-baked facade. Through this landscape of fear, Silas Kane moved with the confident, leisurely swagger of a man who believes he has already won. He was a master of cruel theater. He called a town meeting in the shell of the burned-out schoolhouse and, with a face full of performative sorrow, made a grand public show of donating a substantial sum of his own money to have it rebuilt. The gesture was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, cementing his image as the town's benevolent leader in the minds of the fearful, while simultaneously serving as a brutal, unspoken reminder of the consequences of opposing him. He had burned their hope to the ground, and now he was offering to rebuild it in his own image. For Caleb and Ilara, huddled in the sheriff's office, the world had shrunk to the size of 2 small rooms. They were utterly isolated, but their purpose had become singular, forged into a hard, sharp point by their shared grief and love. They knew they had lost the element of surprise. Kane's network of spies was everywhere. Getting Jedediah out of town now was an impossibility. Their witness was a caged bird, and Kane held the key. Their new plan was born of pure desperation. They had to find concrete, undeniable proof to supplement Jedediah's testimony, something physical they could take directly to the U.S. Marshals and bypass the corrupt local authorities entirely. They both knew there was only one place such proof could be hidden, on Kane's sprawling ranch, the former Abernathy property, in the very heart of the wolf's den. But their lowest point, a depth of despair they had not yet imagined, was still to come. Before they could even begin to act on their desperate plan, Kane made his boldest move yet. He had no more need for henchmen in the dark or whispers in the saloon. He would now use the law itself as his weapon, using a puppet judge in the next town, a man whose career and appetites were funded by Kane's money. He had a warrant issued for the arrest of Sheriff Caleb Blackwood. The charges were a grotesque mockery of the truth, dereliction of duty, corruption, and assault, with the public altercation at the wedding twisted into a narrative of a crazed lawman abducting an innocent woman. A posse of a dozen hard-faced men, hired guns wearing tin stars that the corrupt judge had handed out like candy, rode into Redemption Gulch late the next morning. They moved with the arrogance of men who knew they had the full force of a compromised authority behind them. They surrounded the sheriff's office, their rifles held at the ready. Inside, Caleb and Ilara had watched them arrive. Caleb's face was a grim, stony mask. He was a capable man, a deadly fighter, but he was not a fool. He was outgunned, and a firefight would be a slaughter. With Ilara caught in the middle, his primary duty, the one that now superseded all others, was to keep her safe. He made the difficult, soul-crushing decision to surrender. He still had a sliver of faith that he could fight the charges through legal means, a faith that was a testament to the man he was, but a grave underestimation of the depth of Kane's influence. He turned to Ilara, his eyes full of a pain that was far worse than any fear for himself. He took her face in his hands, his gaze memorizing her features. "I will come back for you," he whispered, the words a sacred, desperate promise. "Barricade the door. Do not let anyone in. Do not—" She watched in numb horror as he unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the desk. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the blinding sunlight. His hands raised. The hired guns swarmed him, binding his wrists with a brutal efficiency. Ilara saw the triumphant sneer on the face of the posse's leader as they shoved Caleb toward a horse. She watched as they chained him, the sheriff of Redemption Gulch, like a common criminal. She watched until the cloud of dust kicked up by their departure was the only thing left on the empty street, and then she was completely, terrifyingly alone. With Caleb gone, Silas Kane's endgame entered its final, cruel phase. He did not have Ilara seized immediately. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he chose to play a slow, sadistic psychological game. He wanted to break her spirit, to dismantle the defiant woman she had become and leave only the frightened, helpless girl he could control. He had his men watch her. 2 of them were always there, sitting on the bench outside the general store, their presence a constant, silent threat. They never approached, never spoke. They just watched. He cut off her supplies, passing the word that anyone who sold food or offered aid to the woman in the sheriff's office would be a personal enemy of Silas Kane. It was a sentence of slow starvation, of absolute isolation. He wanted her to feel her helplessness, to understand that every breath she took was by his permission. He wanted her to come to him, to beg. He wanted to prove to the whole town that she, like everything and everyone else in this valley, belonged to him. Ilara was terrified. The silence of the office was a living thing, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the glass. The constant presence of the men outside was a weight on her soul. But her resolve, forged in the crucible of love and tragedy, did not waver. She was no longer the frightened, orphaned girl who had arrived in this town. She was a survivor. She was Caleb's partner. She dragged his heavy desk in front of the door, barricading herself in. She took inventory of the meager supplies they had left, a half-full sack of flour, some coffee, a few tins of beans. It would not last long, but she would not starve, and she would not break. Her days were spent poring over Caleb's maps and notes, his familiar handwriting a comforting presence in the lonely room. She pieced together everything they had learned, everything they had suspected, trying to finish the work they had started together. The more she studied, the clearer her path became. With Caleb imprisoned, the responsibility fell to her. She was the only one left who could find the proof they needed. The frightened girl was gone, and in her place was a woman with a mission. Meanwhile, Caleb was being held in a squalid, windowless jail cell in the next town over. The air was thick with the stench of sickness and despair. He was denied a lawyer, denied a hearing, denied any semblance of justice. It did not take him long to realize the truth. The legal system, the very thing he had dedicated his life to upholding, was completely and utterly compromised by Kane's money. His despair was profound, but not for himself. His every waking thought was consumed by a tormenting fear for Alara. He was haunted by visions of what Kane might do to her. Alone and unprotected, his only hope, a thin and fraying thread, lay with his young, loyal deputy. Before they had taken him, he had managed to slip Ben a small, folded note and whisper a single name: Elias Vance. It was a desperate gamble, a plea sent out into the wilderness for the one man he knew even Kane would have reason to fear, a retired, grizzled U.S. Marshal who lived like a hermit in the mountains. The climax, when it came, was set in motion by Alara. After 3 days of near starvation and psychological siege, she knew she could not wait any longer. Armed with the heavy Colt peacemaker Caleb had taught her to use, a small satchel with a few of his tools, and a desperate plan, she waited for the darkest part of the night, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky. She slipped out the back window of the office, a ghost in the darkness. She was going to Kane's ranch, using the knowledge she had gleaned from their late-night planning sessions. She navigated the treacherous, broken terrain of the back country, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, avoiding the main roads and Kane's patrols. She infiltrated the ranch house, a place that was supposed to have been her gilded cage, now the heart of the enemy's territory. She moved through the opulent, silent rooms like a phantom, her every sense screaming with tension. She found her way to Kane's study, a room filled with symbols of his power and greed, rare books he had never read, expensive liquor, a massive oak desk. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She remembered Caleb's suspicion that men like Kane always kept a private ledger, a secret record of their true dealings. She searched the desk, the walls, the floorboards, behind a heavy bookcase. Her questing fingers found a loose section of paneling. Behind it was a small, hidden safe. Using the tools she had brought, she worked the lock with a desperate patience. It clicked open. Inside, her breath caught in her throat. It was all there. The original, fraudulently signed deeds to the stolen lands. A thick ledger detailing every bribe, every threat, every murder. And at the very bottom, a signed confession from the corrupt judge. A piece of insurance Kane had held over him. Now the key to his own undoing. Just as her fingers closed around the precious documents, a floorboard creaked behind her. A cold, familiar voice dripped with amused contempt. "Looking for something, my dear?" Silas Kane stood in the doorway, a lit cigar in one hand, a pistol in the other. He was not angry. He was triumphant, his eyes gleaming with the pleasure of a cat that has finally cornered its mouse. The confrontation was a terrifying battle of wits and wills. Kane gloated, his voice a low, self-satisfied purr. He told her how he had won, how Caleb would be tried and hanged within the week, how the town, the valley, and she, herself, would finally, officially, belong to him. He detailed his crimes with a chilling, remorseless pride, as if recounting a series of brilliant business transactions. Alara, her heart hammering, stood her ground. She clutched the papers to her chest, playing for time, her mind racing. She did not plead or cower. She met his gaze, her own eyes blazing with a defiant hatred. She taunted him, calling him a coward and a common thief who had to hide behind his money and his thugs. Her defiance began to chip away at his smug composure, enraging him. You have spirit. I will grant you that, he snarled, taking a step closer. I will enjoy breaking it. Just as he lunged for her, the heavy study doors burst open with a deafening crash. Caleb Blackwood stood on the threshold, his face a mask of cold fury. He was flanked by a grizzled, white-bearded man with the hardest eyes Alara had ever seen, and a small, heavily armed posse of grim-faced men. Ben had reached Elias Vance in time, the old marshal, who had held a long-standing suspicion of Kane's activities, had not hesitated. He had moved with the swift, righteous fury of an avenging angel, breaking Caleb out of the corrupt jail with a federal warrant that superseded any local authority. The final, brutal showdown erupted. It was not a clean, heroic gunfight of Western legend. It was a desperate, chaotic, and bloody struggle in the confines of the luxurious mansion. Elias Vance and his men engaged Kane's thugs in a brutal, close-quarters firefight that tore through the opulent rooms. But the final confrontation, the heart of the battle, was between Caleb, Kane, and Alara. The fight spilled from the study out onto a wide stone balcony that overlooked the dark, wind-swept plains. Kane, seeing he was cornered, his men falling around him, made a final, desperate move. He grabbed Alara, yanking her in front of him, his arm a steel band around her throat, his pistol pressed to her temple. It was a cruel, nightmarish echo of the wedding day, a man using her as a human shield to save his own wretched life. Caleb froze, his own gun leveled, his face a torment of rage and fear. But this time, Alara was not a helpless victim. This time, she was a warrior. With a surge of adrenaline, she drove her elbow back with all her strength, smashing it into Kane's ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a single, split second. It was the only opening Caleb needed. In that moment, Caleb fired. The shot was deafeningly loud in the night air, a single, final punctuation mark to a reign of terror. The shot was true. A look of shocked surprise crossed Silas Kane's face. The gun fell from his hand, and he staggered backward, falling from the balcony to end his life in the very dust of the land he had stolen. The gunshot echoed across the plains and then faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. For a moment, no one moved. Then Caleb rushed forward, pulling Alara into his arms. They clung to each other, shaking, their bodies covered in dust and a spattering of blood, surrounded by the wreckage of their fight. They were alive, they were together, and they were finally, blessedly free. But the victory was grim, the cost of their freedom written on their pale, exhausted faces and in the still bodies of the men who lay scattered through the ruined mansion. The immediate aftermath of the showdown was not triumphant. There was no sense of glorious victory, only the stark, hollow echo of violence and a heavy, bone-deep weariness. As the rising sun cast a pale, gray light over the Kane Ranch, it illuminated a scene of brutal finality. The opulent mansion was scarred by gunfire, its lavish furnishings overturned and broken. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the acrid scent of spent gunpowder. Marshal Elias Vance, his grizzled face set like granite, took absolute charge. There was a grim efficiency to his movements as he began the somber process of restoring order. He directed his men to document the scene, to secure the body of Silas Kane where it lay broken in the dust below the balcony, and to round up the remaining, cowering henchmen. Caleb and Alara gave their statements to the old marshal, their voices flat and exhausted, the words feeling like foreign objects in their mouths. They moved and spoke like people in a dream, their bodies still thrumming with the adrenaline of the fight, their minds struggling to comprehend that it was finally, truly over. They rode back into Redemption Gulch not to a hero's welcome, but to a town in a state of profound shock. The news of Kane's death and the exposure of his vast, murderous crimes had spread like a prairie fire, passed in hushed, disbelieving whispers from house to house. The townsfolk, who had so recently shunned them, now stared as they rode down the main street. Their faces were a complex mixture of awe, shamefaced guilt, and a deep, unsettling uncertainty. They looked at Caleb and Alara as if they were ghosts. survivors from a war the town had been too cowardly to fight itself. The power vacuum left by Kane's death was a palpable thing, a nervous, unstable silence that settled over the entire valley. The town's very foundation, built on the corrupt bedrock of Kane's money and influence, had crumbled overnight. The fear he had cultivated was gone, but in its place was a frightening void. No one knew what came next. The following weeks were a period of difficult and messy transition. Marshal Vance stayed on, a formidable and reassuring presence, overseeing the legal proceedings that began to untangle Kane's intricate web of corruption. The stolen ledger and the papers from Kane's safe were a map to his crimes, and Vance followed it relentlessly. The corrupt judge was arrested. Land titles were meticulously examined. The sprawling acres that had been stolen through intimidation and murder were returned to their rightful owners, or, in the case of families like the Millers, held in a territorial trust. Redemption. Gulch began the slow, painful process of healing and rebuilding, not just its burned-out structures, but its shattered moral compass. This period was also one of intense and private healing for Caleb and Alara. They were both deeply scarred by the trauma they had endured, branded by it in ways no one else could see. The quiet of the night was often the cruelest time. Caleb was plagued by nightmares, waking in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the horrific image of Kane holding Alara on the balcony playing over and over behind his eyes. He would see that pistol pressed to her head and his own hand would shake with a phantom helplessness. Alara, too, struggled with the ghosts of the past. She would be going about a simple task, washing a dish, folding a blanket, when a sudden, intense wave of anxiety would wash over her. She would feel the phantom pressure of Kane's arm around her throat, his voice whispering in her ear, and her breath would catch, her hands trembling until the feeling passed. They were free, but the memory of the cage was a shadow that still lingered. Their relationship, forged in the frantic, desperate passion of a life-or-death struggle, now had to learn to breathe in the thin, quiet air of everyday life. The transition was not always smooth. There were moments of unspoken tension and misunderstanding as they navigated the minefield of their shared trauma. Caleb, so accustomed to his solitary grief, would sometimes retreat into himself, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. He would become overly protective, his gaze constantly scanning for threats that were no longer there. And Alara, fiercely independent after a lifetime of being controlled, would sometimes bristle at his watchfulness, mistaking his concern for a lack of faith in her strength. They had to learn a new kind of intimacy, one built not on adrenaline and shared danger, but on patience, halting communication, and a profound, gentle care for each other's invisible wounds. A significant step in their healing, and the towns came with their visits to Sarah Jenkins. The schoolteacher was slowly recovering at the doctor's house. Her body was mending, the bruises fading, the broken bones knitting, but her spirit remained fragile and frightened. Alara spent hours with her every afternoon, sitting by her bedside, reading to her from the books Sarah loved, or sometimes just sitting in a comfortable silence, her presence a steady and reassuring anchor, in nursing her friend back to health, in tending to the wounds that were a stark, physical manifestation of the town's sickness. Alara found that she was also nursing herself. Caleb, watching the deep, quiet bond between the two women, was moved to action. One afternoon, he stood before the small group of men gathered in front of the general store. He did not command them as a sheriff. He spoke to them as a neighbor. He offered to lead the effort to rebuild the schoolhouse, not with Kane's tainted money, but with their own hands. It was a simple offer, but it was a turning point. Men who had previously averted their eyes now met his gaze and nodded. The act of felling trees, sawing lumber, and raising the walls of a new school became a collective act of penance and rebirth for the town. For Caleb, it was the beginning of his own reintegration into the community, not just as its lawman, but as its leader. The social prejudice against them did not vanish overnight. Some resentful townsfolk still viewed Alara as a troublemaker, the catalyst who had brought the upheaval upon them. Whispers still followed her when she walked through town, though they were fewer and quieter now. Then, one afternoon, a poignant and unexpected moment of grace occurred. Ilara was leaving the general store when she saw Martha Gable approaching. It was the same woman who had led the delegation to the sheriff's office, the woman who had called her an Irish harlot. Ilara braced herself for another confrontation, her chin rising instinctively. But Mrs. Gable did not look haughty or accusatory. She looked tired and older than Ilara remembered. She stopped in front of Ilara and, for a long moment, simply looked at her, her eyes filled with a complicated emotion. "Miss O'Connell," she said, her voice quiet and stripped of its former arrogance. I wanted to say, I was wrong." The words seemed to cost her a great deal. "We were all so afraid. We let that man's money and his power blind us to what was right." She looked down at her hands. "I am sorry for the things I said, for the way I treated you." It was not a grand reconciliation. It was not the beginning of a friendship, but it was a start. It was a single, cracked brick being replaced in the town's crumbled foundation, a quiet, humble symbol of its changing heart. Ilara simply nodded, her throat too thick with emotion to speak, and accepted the apology for the fragile peace offering it was. The story's final, deeply emotional climax did not happen in a church or with a grand public declaration. It happened on a quiet evening, weeks later, as the heat of the long summer was beginning to yield to the first cool hints of autumn. Caleb took Ilara's hand and led her up the same winding trail he had shown her before, to the crest of the hill that overlooked the entire valley where Redemption Gulch lay nestled. The landscape, which had once been the symbol of her desolate prison, now looked different under the soft, golden light of dusk. The jagged mountains in the distance seemed less like broken teeth and more like watchful guardians. The small collection of buildings below, with the frame of the new schoolhouse rising among them, looked not like a place of desperation, but of possibility. Caleb did not offer her a ring. He did not fall to one knee. He simply stood beside her, his hand holding hers, and spoke quietly, his voice full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Marshal Vance is leaving next week," he began. "Before he left, he met with the town council. With Kane's influence gone, they have officially offered me the permanent position of sheriff, and with it, a grant of land. Right over there." He pointed to a gentle slope just outside of town, a place with a few sturdy oak trees and a clear view of the valley. "Enough land to build a home." He turned to her then, his gray eyes soft and serious, his hand tightened on hers. "I have been alone for a very long time, Ilara. I thought that was all my life would ever be. But these past weeks, building something with my own hands again, it has woken something up in me." He took a slow breath. "I do not want to build that home alone. I am not talking about a duty or a debt or a contract." He looked directly into her eyes, his soul in his gaze. "I am talking about building a life, a partnership, a home, a future, together, through the hard winters and the good summers. I am not asking you to be my wife, Ilara O'Connell. I am asking you to be my partner, in everything, for all of our days." His words were the most beautiful proposal she could have ever imagined, an offer not of ownership but of a shared journey. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of profound release, of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She looked from his earnest, hopeful face out at the valley below, her new home. "In Ireland," she said, her voice thick but clear, "I used to dream of a new life in America, a life of freedom and hope. But in all my wildest dreams, I could never have imagined a love like this, a love that would walk through fire with me and not be burned away." She turned back to him, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. "Yes, Caleb Blackwood," she whispered. "Yes, I will be your partner." The story did not end with a kiss. It ended with them standing side by side, their hands clasped tightly together, looking out at the vast, wild landscape as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of deep crimson and soft gold. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, and the future was still an unwritten page. But they were no longer alone. They had each other. Their love was not a fairy tale ending written in the stars, but a testament to survival, a quiet, resilient beacon of hope lit in the very heart of the unforgiving West. The final image was of two scarred but finally whole people, ready to build a new life from the ashes of their tragic past. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.